In 1933, the arrival of Adolf Hitler to power forever changed the destiny of Germany. In a few months, the country transformed into a totalitarian state that concentrated power, militarized society, and stifled all forms of dissent. The Nazi ideology imposed a worldview based on racial purity. The Aryans were proclaimed superior, while Jews, Gypsies, political opponents, and other minorities were condemned to marginalization and, finally, to annihilation. Under the command of the SS, a network of concentration camps was raised, intended to destroy morally and physically those whom the regime considered undesirables. With the advance of the war, that network of repression expanded and perfected itself until reaching its most atrocious expression in Bergen-Belsen. Born as a military camp, it transformed into an internment center where hunger, disease, and decomposition were weapons of extermination. More than 50,000 people died there, including Anne Frank and thousands of prisoners exhausted by the death marches. When British troops liberated it in April of 1945, they found a landscape of corpses, epidemics, and human beings on the brink of death. Today, this documentary, built from authentic images and archives restored in color, reveals the magnitude of the horror experienced in Bergen-Belsen, the last face of the Third Reich and the darkest limit of humanity. The origins of the Nazi system, when punishment became state policy. In January of 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of the Reich. Shortly after, the National Socialists initiated a process of power consolidation that aimed directly at their opponents. In this scenario, the need arose to create facilities that would allow controlling, punishing, and re-educating those who resisted the new regime. The state's response was the establishment of detention camps initially managed by paramilitary formations of the party. Among the first to act were the SA detachments, which improvised arrest centers in abandoned factories, castles, and police dependencies. The system was soon formalized. Starting in the spring of that year, the SS, under the direct command of Heinrich Himmler, began to develop their own camp model, separate from the improvised structures. In March, Himmler personally supervised the opening of a camp in Dachau, located on the outskirts of Munich. This facility would become the prototype of the Nazi concentration camp system. From its beginnings, it remained under the exclusive administration of the SS, which marked a fundamental difference with camps managed by other state branches. The general direction of the camps fell into the hands of Theodor Eicke, a former officer with military experience whom Himmler appointed inspector of the concentration camps. Eicke imposed a rigid internal structure based on clear hierarchies and strict regulations. His model was applied first in Dachau and then replicated in new facilities. The system included a chain of command divided between a commander, several adjunct officers, those responsible for the watchtowers, and a staff of guards who acted with almost total autonomy. Daily routines were determined by strict schedules that included formations, forced labor, and punishments. During 1933, the number of centers multiplied rapidly. Some were managed by local authorities, others directly by the SS. However, by the end of that year, the regime decided to centralize the system and closed most of the unofficial camps. The only ones that remained operational were those under Himmler's control and his expanding structure. Dachau consolidated as a model, and its personnel was used as a base to train new officers. The SS created a kind of elite of terror, with specific trainings that included ideology, tactics, and internal administration. In the following years, new facilities were opened following the Eicke model. In 1936, Sachsenhausen was inaugurated north of Berlin, with capacity for thousands of prisoners. That same year, Buchenwald began to be built near Weimar. Both were conceived as permanent camps, with solid barracks, watchtowers, barbed wire, and work areas. The architectural design reflected a clear intention of permanence and expansion. They were no longer improvised spaces, but integrated parts of the state apparatus. The regime's repressive policy broadened the profile of the incarcerated. To the political opponents, mainly communists and social democrats, were added Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, homosexuals, and citizens considered asocial. The criteria were vague and variable, In many cases, a Gestapo evaluation was sufficient to order a detention. These decisions were formalized through protective custody, a legal mechanism that allowed indefinite confinement without trial or defense. Internal violence was an essential part of the system. Eicke authorized the use of extreme physical punishments, forced labor, and prolonged isolation. The SS considered that brutality had an educational effect, and that terror was a legitimate tool to ensure discipline. Beatings, confinement in dark cells, exposure to cold or heat, and public humiliation became normal routines. These methods were not only authorized, but incentivized within the disciplinary logic. On an ideological level, the camps functioned as spaces for reaffirming National Socialist power. Prisoners were forced to sing party hymns, pay homage to the Führer, and participate in military formations. Symbolic architecture also reinforced dominance. Entrances with phrases like "work sets you free," towers with Nazi flags, standardized uniforms for prisoners, and a constant surveillance system that nullified any sense of autonomy. Everything was designed to break the detainee physically and mentally. Between 1933 and 1939, the number of camps decreased in quantity, but increased in size, sophistication, and brutality. The system ceased to be an improvised network and transformed into a well-articulated machinery. The figures reflect that process. While in 1933 there were more than 50 centers, the majority were closed and replaced by large complexes such as Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. In parallel, the number of prisoners increased and diversified. By the end of 1938, thousands of Jews were also interned, especially following the events of the Night of Broken Glass. That night, in November of 1938, marked a new phase in the regime's violence. Coordinated by party authorities, it involved the destruction of synagogues, shops, and Jewish homes throughout the country. More than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Although many were released weeks later, this operation demonstrated how the system could be used as a direct threat against entire communities. From then on, the mass internment of Jews became a tool of political, economic, and racial pressure. In this context, the first experiments with slave labor also began. The SS established agreements with state and private companies to use concentration camp labor in construction, maintenance, and production tasks. The Sachsenhausen camp, for example, was used to manufacture bricks in an adjacent plant. This relationship between the Reich's economic system and the camps anticipated the model that would expand during the war. In 1935, in a region of northern Germany, a military complex began to form that, years later, would acquire notoriety under the name of Bergen-Belsen. At that time, it was not yet part of the concentration camp system. It was conceived as a training facility for military units and later as a camp for prisoners of war. Its development remained in the background compared to the large detention centers like Buchenwald or Sachsenhausen. However, its location and basic structure were already defined. With the start of the war in September of 1939, the concentration camp system acquired a new purpose within the Reich's machinery. From that moment, the camp network became increasingly linked to the regime's expansionist ambitions. The mass detention of individuals was no longer limited to within German territory. In the first months of the occupation of Poland, the security police and the SS organized collective arrests of intellectuals, activists, and social leaders. Although many were executed locally, others were sent to camps in Germany, where they became part of the existing concentration camp universe. In those first transfers from the east, the Sachsenhausen camp received contingents of Poles arrested after the occupation. The category Polish prisoner was added to the system's internal classification, along with symbols that allowed quick identification. Striped uniforms included color patches according to the group they belonged to. The SS used this system to control the detainees and apply collective punishments based on origin or the assigned dangerousness. As the war conflict advanced, the regime took advantage of the cover of war to expand its repressive practices without restrictions. The number of interned people increased steadily, and the detention criteria were broadened. No longer was even an act of opposition required. Mere suspicion or belonging to a category considered undesirable was sufficient to justify entry into a camp. In this context, the SS consolidated their administrative and operational control over the entire system. To coordinate the expansion, the concentration camps inspectorate was strengthened and moved to Oranienburg. From that headquarters, reports on each camp were managed, general directives were sent, and disciplinary processes were controlled. The Inspector General of the camps continued to be Theodor Eicke, whose authority remained until his death in 1943. Under his command, the doctrine of punishment as a method of control remained in force. Public executions, prolonged isolations, and mass beatings were part of the internal regime. During this period, the Ravensbrück camp was inaugurated as an exclusive center for women. It was built in 1939 north of Berlin, with barracks specially designed for that population. Although in its beginnings it had limited capacity, it was expanded several times in the following years. The detainees were forced to perform sewing, cleaning, and construction work under conditions similar to those in other camps. The opening of this center reflected the intention to segment the system according to gender, function, and required level of surveillance. The radicalization of the system was also reflected in the admission criteria. At the end of the 1930s, regional Gestapo commands had free rein to order preventive detentions without the need for concrete charges. This policy was especially harsh on the so-called chronic asocials, a category that included beggars, the unemployed, alcoholics, and women considered promiscuous. In April of 1938, a massive operation ordered the detention of thousands of men under that category. Many were sent to Buchenwald or Dachau, where they were subjected to exhausting work and constant punishments. Homosexuals were also the target of specific campaigns. The regime intensified raids and used the camps as an instrument to correct their behavior. In internal records, these prisoners were marked with pink triangles, and they were often segregated from the rest. The SS considered them especially dangerous and usually subjected them to exemplary punishments. Mortality rates among them were higher than average. During this same period, tensions between different branches of Nazi power became evident. While the SS consolidated their absolute dominance over the camps, some sectors of the army and the Ministry of the Interior expressed reservations about certain excesses. However, those objections had no practical effects. The concentration of power in the hands of Himmler and his apparatus prevented any real control. The system remained as a parallel structure, closed and without external oversight. The regime's propaganda deliberately omitted what happened inside the camps. In public discourse, they spoke of work centers or places of re-education. Official visits were organized in advance, the facilities were cleaned, and the internees were instructed on how to behave. These maneuvers sought to project an image of order, discipline, and correction. However, the internal reality was completely different, marked by punishment, arbitrariness, and systematic exploitation. Regarding the internal hierarchy, the camps operated with absolute authoritarian logic. The commanders had total power over the prisoners and the staff. Decisions could include corporal punishments, summary executions, or reductions in food rations. Many SS officers made careers within the concentration camp system, and their loyalty to the regime was rewarded with promotions, awards, and privileges. Another characteristic was the creation of the capo system, prisoners selected by the SS to assume supervisory roles over their companions. These individuals were usually chosen from among the detainees with the most violent profiles or from common criminals. In exchange for their collaboration, they received better rations, greater freedom of movement, and protection from punishments. The capo system generated internal tensions and multiplied everyday violence, as many used their power to abuse the other prisoners. As the system expanded, the categories of prisoners also multiplied. In addition to political opponents, asocials, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews arrested for racial reasons began to arrive. Although their number was still limited compared to what would come later, their presence in camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen was already evident before 1939. In many cases, these detainees were subjected to special punishments or more severe confinement. The internal logic of the camps did not contemplate rehabilitation or fair trial. The prisoners were considered enemies of the state, with no possibility of appeal. There were no defined deadlines for their release, and communication with the outside was minimal or non-existent. Letters were censored, packages were blocked, and family visits were practically non-existent. Everything was oriented toward generating isolation, total dependence, and absolute submission. The training of the surveillance personnel followed ideological norms. The guards received political instruction, military exercises, and rules for treating the prisoners. They were taught to see the detainees as inferiors, traitors, or saboteurs. This dehumanization was key to justifying the systematic use of violence. The relationship between guard and prisoner was not based on legal rules, but on absolute obedience to the command structure and National Socialist ideology. In parallel, the SS began to document in detail every aspect of the camp's operation. Records were kept of admissions, categories, punishments applied, and deaths occurred. These files were sent periodically to the central office in Oranienburg. The bureaucracy of terror left nothing to chance. Each camp had registration offices, medical departments, work areas, and punishment zones, all structured with military precision. By the end of 1939, the German concentration camp system operated as a fundamental instrument of the National Socialist state. Although a systematic extermination policy did not yet exist, the key elements were already present: detention without trial, brutal punishment, forced labor, and ideological repression. The apparatus functioned with efficiency, internal loyalty, and total support from the party leadership. The territorial expansion generated by the war now offered new scenarios to replicate this model, whether in the occupied East or in other regions under German control. The Kingdom of Hunger, the slow transformation of captivity into death. With the start of the war, the map of detentions transformed completely. Prisoners of war, civilians captured in raids, and political opponents were sent to the first already operational camps. The testimonies agree that the officers never offered information about the destination or explanations about the reasons for the detention. On board trains with constant surveillance, many detainees spent weeks waiting in remote stations before being taken to the assigned place. Bergen-Belsen, initially used as a military installation, began to function as a temporary internment camp for enemy soldiers. However, as the war advanced, its function changed completely. The military administration was replaced by personnel under SS control. The space was conditioned with empty barracks and additional fences. The original structures proved insufficient to contain the growing number of inmates. The deportees were identified upon arrival through a system of numbers assigned on cards. In the first months, there was no clear systematization. In several camps of the system, the complete identity registration was omitted, which made communication between families difficult. Civilian clothing was removed from most. Some declared that they received uniforms from enemy soldiers with insignia torn off. The French captured in the first months of 1940 were transported in groups from provisional camps to facilities like Belsen. One of them described how upon arrival they were forced to wait hours outside while inspections were carried out by the guard. During the winter, that practice was maintained, regardless of the temperature. Many were ordered to sleep directly on the ground during the first days. Only afterward were they assigned space in shared barracks. The administration placed up to 50 people per room. The bunks were wooden without mattresses. The blankets, scarce, were shared in pairs. Hygiene conditions deteriorated rapidly. The wash basins had no running water, and the waste buckets were not emptied regularly. In several statements, it is recounted that the buckets, once full, remained inside for days. Infections spread from the first weeks. During the years 1941 and 1942, Soviet prisoners began to arrive in greater numbers. Many were soldiers captured on the Eastern Front. The majority were in a state of physical exhaustion. They did not speak German or French, which made their integration into the already established groups difficult. The SS officers considered them of lower category. They were often placed in the most deteriorated areas of the enclosure. Several witnesses observed that the Soviets did not receive adequate clothing. Some continued to wear torn garments from the front. Mortality among them was high from the first months. The most common causes were intestinal infections, pneumonia, and advanced malnutrition. The records cited in the book include a testimony recounting the arrival of more than 1,200 Russian prisoners to a camp that already exceeded its capacity. In that case, the new deportees were placed in an uncovered area. They spent 3 nights outdoors without shelter in the middle of November. After that episode, more than 100 died in the first week. The authorities did not take measures to modify the lodging. The casualties were recorded but not notified to the families. Throughout this period, the practice of separating prisoners by nationality or language was maintained. The Poles were housed in contiguous barracks, but without contact with the Belgian or French internees. The official reason alleged was disciplinary control. However, some survivors claim that it was to avoid solidarity between groups. Constant changes of location were also common. Every 2 weeks, several internees were transferred between camps without explanation. That rotation disoriented the newcomers and affected internal stability. The sick did not receive specific attention. They were separated only when the fever prevented them from moving on their own. Although the so-called final solution had not yet been fully implemented within Bergen-Belsen, signs of programmed abandonment were already perceived. Those responsible did not directly execute the prisoners, but they did maintain a regime of sustained deprivation. Food was progressively reduced, medications were non-existent, and clothing was not replaced. In some cases, differentiated rations were detected according to the detainee's country of origin. A Belgian internee noted that upon complaining about the lack of food, a guard responded that the French could still work, while the Russians were dispensable. Workdays were imposed without notice. Men were assigned tasks of loading, digging, or transporting materials. The previous physical state was not considered. In many cases, prisoners weakened by illnesses were forced to show up anyway. Punishments were applied through food reduction or prolonged isolation. Some witnesses described that there was an underground cell used to lock up those considered rebels. Those sanctions were not officially recorded. The transition of Bergen-Belsen toward a concentration camp was consolidated between 1942 and 1943, when a complete administrative structure was established under exclusive SS control. From then on, the intake of non-combatant civilians increased. Young women, elderly people, and persons with disabilities began to arrive from other points of the Reich. They were not assigned labor functions. They were housed in special pavilions without contact with political prisoners. That segmentation reflected a change in the logic of confinement. It was no longer just about isolating enemies of the state, but about eliminating populations considered not useful. During 1942, convoys arriving from various annexed territories brought increasingly more people classified as enemies of the regime. At the same time, the camp authorities hardened the treatment, assigning the newcomers to already overcrowded barracks, where no distinction was made between groups by nationality or detention category. In that context, survivors declared having been transferred to places like Bergen-Belsen under direct orders, without prior notice, and without knowing the fate that awaited them. The facilities did not have sufficient structures to house the growing volume of prisoners. The bunks, improvised in rows of 3 levels, were shared by more than one person. The testimonies agree that the windows were sealed, and the lack of ventilation aggravated the effects of continuous confinement. One of the accounts collected in the archives mentioned that, since there was no space for everyone, many slept on the floor, lined up in the aisles. For that same year, arrivals of French and Belgian citizens who had been accused of sabotage activities or collaboration with the resistance were documented. These were placed in the same sections as the Soviet prisoners of war, which generated tensions due to language, the treatment received, and differences in access to small portions of food. The guards, for their part, maintained strict but disorganized surveillance without establishing clear protocols for handling so many diverse groups. Some Polish women declared having been confined together with sick men in spaces that did not differentiate between sex or age. Work assignments did not respond to physical or health criteria. To one of them, for example, she was ordered to carry heavy metal pieces despite being visibly weakened, and upon refusing she was beaten in front of the others. In 1943, conditions deteriorated even further with the arrival of massive transports from Eastern Europe. Among the newly interned were former Red Army officers, civilian doctors, railway employees, even teenagers captured in urban raids. The administration did not enable new spaces, and the old military facilities, hastily adapted, could not withstand the pressure. Many roofs had leaks and there was no heating. The spread of intestinal diseases was one of the most mentioned effects in the archives. As there was no clean water, the drinking containers were the same ones used as containers for other hygienic purposes. This caused repeated infections, especially among the detainees who occupied the lower levels of the bunks, where liquids filtered down from above. The camp officials did not introduce any basic sanitary treatment system. A prisoner identified as Pavel D., a former engineer in a Warsaw factory, recounted how for entire weeks they were not allowed to go outside. The only air intake came from small slits near the ceiling. In his testimony, he explained that at least 5 people died in his barrack before the bodies were removed. In some cases, the other inmates had to coexist with the corpses for more than 24 hours. By 1943, the proportion of deaths exceeded any figure documented in previous years. Although the camp authorities did not keep open records, partial lists compiled by the prisoners themselves were recovered, where the names of those who did not wake up in the morning were marked. One of those lists indicated 43 deaths in a single month within a single pavilion. There was also no efficient identification system. Many detainees were registered only by their number, without noting either their country of origin or the reason for their detention. This made internal organization difficult, even among the inmates themselves, who sometimes did not know with whom they shared space. New arrivals were integrated without any orientation and had to learn by observation or receive clandestine help from more veteran ones. Among the direct responsible parties, supervisors who had previously been guards in camps like Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald are mentioned. Some already had documented records of abuse but were reassigned without any evaluation. One of them, cited in a survivor's testimony, imposed random physical punishments without explaining the reason, and usually forced detainees to maintain forced positions for hours. During that same year, additional interior fences began to be built within the enclosure, separating areas according to the nationality or physical condition of the prisoners. Divisions with simple wire were erected to isolate those considered non-productive, that is, elderly or weakened people. Some testimonies relate that once transferred to that section, they were never seen again. In the entrance area, where new prisoners waited to be assigned, some spent up to 2 nights outdoors. They were not provided with shelter nor allowed to move freely. Those who fainted were removed by other prisoners under strict orders not to raise their voice or alert about the condition of others. Several witnesses remembered hearing muffled screams that suddenly stopped in the middle of the darkness. The winter of horror, women and children trapped in Bergen-Belsen. At the end of 1944, the camp system in Germany experienced a violent shock with the arrival of Josef Kramer, who had been in charge of Auschwitz-Birkenau. His transfer to Bergen-Belsen was not a simple change of destination, but the direct importation of the most brutal administration methods within the Reich's concentration camp structure. Several subordinates arrived with him, many of them veterans from other camps. The surveillance, discipline and treatment model applied in eastern Poland began to be reproduced in the lower Saxony region. The facility had been initially conceived as a transit center, but by that time it was already functioning as a permanent camp. The transports, many of them improvised, did not cease. They carried hundreds of people without food or water in closed wagons during journeys that lasted days. The final destination of those trains was an esplanade surrounded by wire and watchtowers, where chaos surpassed any type of planning. There were not enough barracks, and the common spaces were invaded by the newcomers. The figures quickly exceeded the initial forecasts. In less than 2 months, the records doubled their capacity. Thousands arrived from Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen, Neuengamme, Mauthausen and Buchenwald. The orders from Berlin were clear: evacuate the eastern camps in the face of the Red Army's advance. Bergen-Belsen thus became a human dump, without prepared infrastructures or sufficient personnel to manage that overpopulation. The number of women increased exponentially. Many had passed through other camps and showed visible symptoms of malnutrition and infectious diseases. Some were mothers, but children under 15 years old were separated from the entrance, housed in different barracks where they accumulated without beds or adequate clothing. Most did not resist more than a few weeks. The ground became a quagmire where feet sank into the mud and lifeless bodies lay for days without being removed. In the diaries written by female prisoners, a constant was repeated: the total lack of hygiene. There was no soap, the toilets collapsed in a matter of days, and the women shared dirty rags as the only sanitary resource. Lice were omnipresent. The typhus epidemic spread uncontrollably from the first month. The camp's medical team, reduced to a few inmates with basic knowledge, had no means to contain the outbreak. Kramer restricted food supplies under the pretext of discipline. The bread arrived mouldy and cut into slices that were distributed among 5 or 6 people. The soup, if it appeared, was dark water with traces of cabbage. Weight loss became generalized. Adult bodies dropped below 30 kilograms. The immune system collapsed and inmates died in chain, without attention or registration. The sanitary infrastructure collapsed. The infirmary had 20 beds to attend to more than 20,000 people. Medical material was scarce. There were no bandages, no thermometers, no disinfectants. Rats ran under the stretchers, and the sick died without receiving treatment. Those who entered there did not come out. The room became an antechamber to the mass grave. By January of 1945, deaths were reaching between 800 and 1,000 per week, a figure that Kramer himself tried to hide by manipulating the records. Testimonies from women like Hannah Levy-Haas detail scenes where girls died embraced with their mothers. Some women hid their children in dark corners to avoid their transfer. Desperation had annulled any trace of social structure. Female prisoners of different nationalities, without a common language, looked at each other without being able to communicate. Fights over food scraps, shoes, or blankets were constant. Prisoner groups organized according to their origin. The women transferred from the Litzmannstadt ghetto were confined in an area without latrines or access to clean water. They remained locked up for days, in spaces without ventilation. In those conditions, intestinal infections spread rapidly, and many detainees died shortly after. Cases of cholera were also recorded, although medical reports barely managed to document them in the face of the advance of typhus. In the midst of that collapse emerged the name of Gina Turgel, a young Jewish woman deported from Krakow along with her sisters. After her passage through Auschwitz and other centers, she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen at the end of 1944. Her account describes a completely dark barrack, full of motionless bodies, where silence was broken by dry coughs and faint cries. Gina was assigned to the infirmary, where she assisted dying women without medical knowledge. One of them had lost her 2 daughters on the journey. Another was delirious with fever and was dragged outside by the guards. No one saw her again. Kramer avoided direct contact with the internees. His figure was known only through punishments. Beatings were reported for approaching the fence, collective sanctions for indiscipline, and prolonged confinements in barracks without ventilation. Punishments were carried out by auxiliaries, many of them recruited from the ranks of female SS, trained in Ravensbrück. Their names do not appear in the archives, but they were described as young, mostly German, who acted with absolute indifference to suffering. The days were indistinguishable from each other. There was no predictable routine. Sometimes 24 hours passed without any type of food distribution. The morning count, mandatory even in snow, was carried out in rows of hundreds. Those who fell to the ground were not lifted. They remained there until others dragged them to the side. The name of Anne Frank is mentioned in internal records around February of 1945. Along with her sister Margot, she had been evacuated from Auschwitz. Her arrival coincided with one of the mortality peaks. They were placed in a barrack with dozens of teenagers without supervision. Both contracted typhus. Her death, according to cross-testimonies, occurred at the end of that month or early March. No one was a direct witness. There was no burial. The body was piled with the others. The persistent cold worsened the situation. There was no heating. The blankets were infested. Some internees slept on the floor on cardboard. Clothing was not changed for weeks. In those conditions, typhus ravaged without obstacles. Official figures spoke of 18,000 dead in 3 months. The camp archives, however, omitted dozens of names due to lack of personnel to record them. The winter of 1945 was particularly harsh. Temperatures dropped below zero. Gusts of wind entered through the wooden slits. The roofs cracked. Rain penetrated directly onto the sleeping bodies. The garments were permanently wet. In that state, colds evolved into pneumonia in a matter of hours. Death was immediate. The dead were no longer mourned. They were pushed to the side. In the last days of March of 1945, the situation in Bergen-Belsen no longer responded to any administrative scheme. The barracks were so saturated that hundreds of prisoners slept outdoors, leaning against the wooden walls, wrapped in rags picked up from the floor. Lack of movement, extreme weakening, and cold caused silent deaths. Each dawn brought frozen bodies that no one removed. Lists were no longer made. The guards had stopped counting. Upon reaching April of 1945, the camp had ceased to function as a detention center. It was a zone of massive abandonment. Those responsible knew there was no return, and orders from Berlin no longer had value. The collapse was total. The barbed wire still stood, but inside there was nothing left to control. The stench was unbearable. From afar, the camp was recognized by the mixture of rot, excrement, and smoke. Some prisoners lit small fires with papers or wood scraps to try to dry the infested clothing. Occasionally, those fires were extinguished with blows by the auxiliaries. Skin infections, such as scabies and boils, spread rapidly. Hands, feet, and faces were covered with sores that did not heal. Among the few who still retained physical strength was Katarina Hardy, a young Slovak who had been transferred with her mother from Ravensbrück. The transport had lasted 5 days. In the wagon, according to her testimony, 4 people died. Upon arriving at Bergen-Belsen, they were directed to the women's sector, where no beds were available. During the first days, they ate nothing. Then they received half a slice of hard bread and a bit of murky water. Katarina remembers having witnessed how a woman was punished for trying to filter water with her blouse. She was beaten in front of 20 other internees. In the children's area, the panorama was even more devastating. Some children, too weak to cry, remained seated for hours without moving until falling unconscious. Others murmured songs in their native languages. A Romanian prisoner tried to organize a list of the living miners, but abandoned the attempt after 2 days. Many did not know their full names. Others were too sick to speak. The hierarchical structure of the camp had collapsed. The capos had no clear functions. Some continued giving empty orders. Others mixed with the rest of the prisoners, stripped of authority. In that context, bartering intensified. A piece of bread could be obtained in exchange for a pair of broken shoes, a spoonful of soup in exchange for an infected blanket. Hunger nullified any sense of dignity. The crudest accounts of that period mention scenes where women washed the bodies of their dead daughters to lay them down one last time with clean clothes. Others kept their relatives seated, leaning against the wall, pretending they were still alive, so as not to lose space in the barrack. Voices had fallen silent. Barely any isolated words were heard in Yiddish, Polish, or Hungarian. The generalized silence was more disturbing than the screams of previous months. Gina Turgel, who had managed to stay alive thanks to her role in the infirmary, was a direct witness to the final collapse. In her account, she mentions a specific day when more than 60 bodies were collected just in her sector. The infirmary was no longer functional. It was a waiting chamber for death. She tried to clean wounds with dirty rags and give water in tin spoons. In one of the nearby barracks, a mother left her baby wrapped in a sack in front of the infirmary. She never returned. Kramer remained secluded in his office, isolated from the disaster. His visits to the camp became sporadic. When he did, he was accompanied by other officers and did not address a word to the prisoners. On one occasion, according to internal records, he ordered the complete closure of a barrack due to infectious risk. Inside, more than 100 people remained without assistance. The door was sealed with wire. Decisions in those days were arbitrary. Some inmates were transferred from one sector to another without clear reason. Others simply disappeared. It was suspected that bodies were thrown into open pits on the edge of the forest. There were no photographic records, but some testimonies coincide in pointing out the existence of at least 3 active ditches used as mass graves. Attempts at resistance were symbolic. A woman tried to write with charcoal on the wall of her barrack the names of her sisters. Another buried a piece of bread as a sign of mourning. Some hugged each other at night without speaking. The simplest gestures became acts of unusual humanity. Sharing a blanket, exchanging a button, looking into each other's eyes. The physical appearance of the survivors was ghostly. Gina Turgel remembers that many women did not know their age, nor the month. Some repeated meaningless phrases, others scratched their skin compulsively until bleeding. Fear had disappeared, only exhaustion remained. Some wanted to die. Others no longer distinguished the difference between sleeping and losing consciousness. In the last days before liberation, according to testimonies, some officers were observed destroying documents. Others simply abandoned their posts. The female guards, mostly young, removed their uniforms and hid them under the inmates' clothing. They anticipated possible external intervention. Shots in the air were frequent. Some inmates thought a mass execution was approaching. The figure of Josef Kramer reappeared briefly, trying to organize a late distribution of food. Several trucks arrived with bread and cans, but the delivery was chaotic. Avalanches were generated. There were confrontations. Some women died crushed while trying to reach a can of soup. The convoy did not return. In that context of ruin, the few survivors began to form small groups. They protected each other. They shared silence. Some women wove pieces of cloth aimlessly. Others wrote their names on cardboards. They still did not know they were days from the end. Bergen-Belsen was no longer a camp. It was an open cemetery without order or law. The hour of truth. Bergen-Belsen liberated. On the 15th of April of 1945, early in the morning, units of the 11th Corps of the British Second Army advanced toward the vicinity of the Bergen-Belsen camp. The operation was carried out under the command of General Brian Horrocks and was directed by the 63rd Brigade under orders from Brigadier Glyn Hughes. Only a few days earlier, the British had received a German proposal to hand over the camp without resistance, and although it was initially met with distrust, patrols were soon organized to verify its truthfulness. The encounter between the British and the German officers took place on the road connecting Celle with Bergen, and there the soldiers were informed by Colonel Hans Schmidt that there was a camp with thousands of prisoners affected by typhus, dysentery, and total lack of food. The first troops that crossed the camp perimeter did so with a mixture of caution and incredulity. The area surrounding the facilities was full of improvised barracks, abandoned watchtowers, and fences without active surveillance. The soldiers of the 249th Brigade of the Royal Army Medical Corps, accompanied by units of the 113th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, immediately discovered a situation that exceeded any forecast. A few meters from the main entrance, the vehicles stopped before the presence of bodies lying on the ground, many of them naked, others in an advanced state of decomposition. The soldiers had to move them aside to continue. Throughout that day and the following ones, the British toured the different sections of the camp. Bergen-Belsen was divided into sectors: the Lager 1, the main women's area; the Lager 2, destined for prisoners evacuated from the east; and a section known as Zeltlager, with tents for the newly arrived. In total, the medical reports prepared by the British officers calculated that there were more than 60,000 people alive, of which between 10,000 and 20,000 and 13,000 were in a terminal state. During the first 48 hours, deaths were counted in the hundreds. According to the diary of Lieutenant Michael Hargrave, a recently graduated doctor assigned to the intervention team, on the first day nearly 500 people died, a figure that remained constant for the next 10 days. The immediate task consisted of establishing a chain of basic assistance. Medical attention posts were improvised in trucks and tents, mobile disinfection units were installed, and routes were traced for transporting the sick to more stable areas. However, resources were limited. The doctors of the Royal Army Medical Corps worked alongside Dutch volunteers and soldiers who had no health training. By the first 5 days of entry, Hargrave noted in his notebook that his team had already intervened in more than 900 patients, most of whom suffered from infections derived from malnutrition and lack of hygiene. Typhus exanthematicus, bacterial dysentery, scurvy, and various forms of tuberculosis were diagnosed in almost all sectors of the camp. In addition to medical attention, the British faced the problem of unburied bodies. The number was so high that there were no immediate means to bury them conventionally. In one of the first decisions made by the Allied command, the former German guards and the camp's administrative personnel were ordered to collaborate in burying the corpses. Under armed surveillance, dozens of men in SS uniforms were forced to dig mass graves and load bodies under direct supervision. This task became part of the audiovisual documentation carried out by the army units, and it became one of the most widely disseminated elements by the British press weeks later. The emotional shock suffered by the soldiers was recorded in intelligence reports and in the personal diaries of several officers. Many declared that they had never witnessed anything similar before. Hargrave described the sensation of walking between barracks with collapsed roofs, rotten mattresses, and people who could no longer speak or move. The stench was constant, and some members of the troops had to be withdrawn for presenting uncontrollable vomiting. In one of the central courtyards, the doctors improvised a triage station with a tarp hung between two posts, where they classified the sick according to the degree of possibility of survival. As the days progressed, efforts to document the scene intensified. The British intelligence divisions, along with army cameras, filmed every corner of the camp. Aerial photographs were taken, terrain plans and brief interviews with some survivors were recorded. The objective was to create an archive that would allow informing authorities and international media. Some of those images were used during the preparatory sessions of the Nuremberg trial. General Horrocks ordered that no German civilian could claim ignorance about what had happened. To that end, he organized guided visits for inhabitants of nearby towns. In groups of 20, men and women from Bergen and Celle were transported to the camp, led between the piles of bodies, and exposed to the reports prepared by the doctors. This measure sought to have the local population directly confront what had occurred in their immediate environment. The British general noted in his memoirs that this decision was one of the most difficult, but also one of the most necessary. In the first 15 days after liberation, more than 13,000 people died, many of them too weakened to withstand the change in conditions. The medical team, headed by Hargrave, improvised attention spaces in tents due to the collapse of the original barracks. The disinfection team applied DDT powder to clothing, blankets, and the walls of the facilities. Mattresses were burned, barrels with contaminated water were destroyed, and latrines were sealed with lime. Even so, the risk of typhus spread persisted for weeks. On April 30th, the British commands ordered the construction of a new provisional camp about 2 kilometers from the original, where the survivors were transferred in stages. This area was baptized as Camp 2 and was administered by health officers under direct supervision of the War Ministry. On May 1st, the total number of soldiers and medical personnel assigned to Bergen-Belsen reached 800 effectives. In addition to British, there were volunteers from the Swedish Red Cross, Canadian doctors, and logistical support personnel from the Polish Army. The international presence was reflected in the War Office records, which described the operation as one of the most complex on enemy territory. The discovery of Bergen-Belsen marked a turning point in the perception of the conflict. The British press published the first reports on April 19th, accompanied by images captured by the Army's filming teams. In editorials of the Times and the Daily Telegraph, the scene was described as a crime of unknown dimensions. The most repeated words in those days were inconceivable and monstrous. However, the medical testimonies, the graphic records, and the voice of the soldiers themselves began to configure an irrefutable reality. In the days following the 15th of April, the British commands began to structure the temporary administration of the camp. The sanitary direction was assumed by Brigadier Glyn Hughes, who delegated logistical functions to Colonel James Johnston and Lieutenant Colonel M.W. Gonin. Under their coordination, permanent medical shifts were established, with rotations every 12 hours, and a patient registry was initiated to allow distributing attention based on each person's physical condition. The number of available beds was limited, so the doctors opted to assign them only to those who had real chances of surviving. The cases considered irreversible were transferred to an improvised palliative care area in the former officers' block. There, the team led by Hargrave documented more than 400 deaths in just 5 days. Close to 75% of the liberated prisoners presented active infectious diseases, according to medical reports. To contain the spread of typhus, they even resorted to using flamethrowers to eliminate contaminated materials. On the 19th of April, the Hohn area, a former German military zone near the camp, was enabled as a medical evacuation center. There, nearly 15,000 survivors were transferred in trucks adapted with stretchers. The most weakened were attended by British personnel and volunteers from the Swedish Red Cross. The lack of medications, especially antibiotics, forced the use of rudimentary methods, such as gastric lavages, poultices, and saline solutions. Sanitary control also included the vaccination of British soldiers. Doses against typhus, cholera, and dysentery were distributed to the entire troop. In parallel, measures were taken to limit access to the camp. Only authorized personnel could enter certain areas, and security perimeters with restricted access were established. These actions aimed to prevent massive contagion and preserve the operability of the medical team. The British intelligence divisions filmed every corner of the camp, including collapsed barracks, piled bodies, and survivors without strength. Part of the material was directed by filmmaker Billy Wilder and photographer George Roger. The images were edited in London and broadcast in American newsreels, and also used as evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Among the visitors who toured the camp after the liberation was Rabbi Leslie Hardman, chaplain of the British Army, who officiated funeral ceremonies for the victims. In his personal diary, he described the scene as a landscape of continuous death. Observers from the World Zionist Organization, representatives of the British Ministry of Information, and BBC journalists also participated. The commander Kramer, along with several of his collaborators, was arrested immediately after the arrival of the troops. The British documented his capture with photographs and written statements. Kramer was forced to witness the mass burials and to explain the internal functioning of the camp. His responses were considered evasive by the officers in charge. The recordings of these interrogations were included in the archive that would later serve as the basis for the judicial process. General Bernard Montgomery was personally informed of the state of the camp. In his dispatch from the Second Army, he received detailed reports prepared by Brigadier Hughes. In response, he ordered an increase in the allocation of medical resources and requested that a team of epidemiology experts be sent from London. The Ministry of Information prepared an official report on the situation in Bergen-Belsen, distributed on the 21st of April to embassies and press agencies. It included preliminary figures, soldier statements, and a photographic gallery with the most impactful scenes. The objective was to make known what had happened without filters, as direct proof of the crimes committed. Among the most cited documents was the report by Major Leonard Burney, who described with precision the camp's recovery process, the number of victims, the sanitary conditions, and the actions taken by the army. His text was sent to the United Nations as part of the record of documented atrocities. The progressive withdrawal of British personnel began in early June. By that time, the camp had been disinfected, the survivors had been relocated, and the remains of the original structure were being dismantled. Bergen-Belsen ceased to exist as a concentration camp, but its name had already been recorded in the archives, reports, and memories of those who saw it. From that instant, the world could no longer look the other way. Between justice and silence, the long echo of the Nazi crime. On the 17th of September of 1945, the British military tribunal in Lüneburg was constituted to initiate the judicial process against those who had been in charge of the Bergen-Belsen camp and, to a lesser extent, of Auschwitz. Josef Kramer headed the list of the 45 accused. Alongside him sat 16 women, most former SS guards in surveillance or administrative functions. Other defendants had been part of the camp's medical staff or had been prisoners with internal responsibilities who collaborated with the Germans. The trial, officially called the Belsen trial, lasted almost 2 months. The sessions started at 10:30 in the morning and extended into the afternoon. Each of the accused was represented by a defense lawyer appointed by the British. The main prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel M.G. Champion de Crespigny, presented the charges based on the law of war and the Geneva Conventions. The tribunal considered as crimes deliberate murder, systematic torture, the inhumane conditions imposed on the detainees, and the deliberate failure to fulfill medical and sanitary duties. Among the main pieces of evidence were hundreds of photographs taken after the liberation of the camp, British medical reports, and sworn statements from survivors. Several witnesses were called to the stand. Many had been deported from occupied countries such as the Netherlands, France, Hungary, or Poland. Some had worked in the kitchen, in the infirmary, or had been confined for months without access to drinking water or sufficient food. The trial sessions were open to the public. Galleries were enabled for the press and civilian observers. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was sober. The accused wore grey uniforms. Josef Kramer maintained an impassive attitude, taking notes and listening attentively to each testimony. Irma Gräser, one of the most notorious former guards, was described by the press as calm and cold. Her youth, she was only 22 years old, contrasted with the crimes of which she was accused. The defense tried to argue that the accused were only following orders. In some cases, they claimed that the chaos in the last days of the war prevented maintaining adequate sanitary or food conditions. Attempts were also made to discredit the surviving witnesses, suggesting that they exaggerated the facts or confused identities due to the trauma suffered. The court rejected the most common defensive arguments. It considered that the accused had had sufficient room for maneuver to oppose the abuses or report irregularities. In the case of the doctors, it was proven that they knew the sanitary state of the camp and did nothing to mitigate the suffering. The ruling concluded that the crimes had been committed systematically and not accidentally. On the 17th of November of 1945, the sentences were handed down. 11 of the accused were sentenced to the gallows. Among them were Josef Kramer, Irma Graeser, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Fritz Klein. Another 19 received prison sentences ranging from life imprisonment to lesser sentences of 10 years. Some were acquitted due to lack of direct evidence. The executions were carried out in Hamelin prison on the 13th of December of that same year. The executioner was Albert Pierre Point. The operation was executed quickly. The condemned were led one by one to the scaffold without access to appeals or delays. The decision was criticized by some international observers who expected a more prolonged review of the crimes committed in the concentration camp system. The trial records were kept in detailed form. The minutes, photographs, sworn testimonies, and forensic reports were preserved. All that material was subsequently used by historians, journalists, and educators. The documentation was also presented as evidence in other denazification processes held in the post-war period. Over time, the decisions of the Lüneburg military court began to be analyzed with greater distance. It was pointed out that the most severe sentences focused on visible figures like Kramer or Graeser, while many equally responsible individuals were never tried. In some cases, internal collaborators who participated in the oppression of other prisoners received light sentences or were released shortly thereafter. In subsequent decades, historiography reviewed the trial as an ambiguous symbol. On one hand, it was a pioneering legal action to punish crimes against humanity. But it also reflected the limits of international justice in its early stages. The trial failed to encompass the entire network of responsibilities that allowed Bergen-Belsen to function as it did. In 1985, during the 40th anniversary of the liberation, several former survivors publicly expressed their disappointment. They considered that many key figures never faced real consequences. In response, German authorities organized discussion panels on collective responsibility and the transmission of memory. The trial files were updated, and part of the original material was republished in annotated editions. After the Lüneburg trial, the Bergen-Belsen site came under British control. The barracks were demolished for sanitary reasons, and human remains were buried in mass graves. The area was closed to civilian access and marked with provisional signs. In the immediate years, international interest focused on judicial proceedings and the reconstruction of Europe. The site was temporarily relegated to institutional silence. In 1952, the authorities of Lower Saxony authorized the creation of a first memorial. A large commemorative slab was installed marking the place of the collective burials. The design was austere and avoided specific references to nationalities or religions. Throughout the decade, plaques with more detailed inscriptions were added, including dates, victim figures, and generic mentions of Nazi crimes. However, the absence of historical context made it difficult for visitors to understand the real scope of what happened. In this scenario of partial and silent memory, during the 1960s, historians began to systematically document the history of Bergen-Belsen, recovering archives and testimonies that allowed reconstructing its evolution from a prisoner camp to a concentration camp. In 1966, a small documentation center was inaugurated, although with limited resources and little public dissemination. In the 1970s and 1980s, the debate on Holocaust memory gained strength in West Germany. Jewish associations and former deportees pushed for a review of the memorial, despite resistance from conservative sectors. In 1985, the 40th anniversary of the liberation marked a change. Memory was emphasized as a historical warning. In the 1990s, the site was redesigned with a new educational and inclusive approach toward all victims. Finally, in 2007, the modern Bergen-Belsen Documentation Center was inaugurated, managed by the Lower Saxony Memorials Foundation, with state support and multilingual and digital resources.